G'day, this is Chris Savage from Aaron Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Jeremiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So we're back into session 9 now, and we're looking at chapter 12, verse 1 down to chapter 13, verse 27. If you remember last session, God had informed Jeremiah about a conspiracy against his life by the men of Anathoth. Now, remember, Anathoth was Jeremiah's hometown. So this was quite a shock to Jeremiah because he knew nothing about it until God revealed it to him. And this, we see, was the first of what is going to be many personal crises in the book. And this affected him very deeply because, you know, he saw himself as a lamb being led to slaughter. And this conspiracy, what was the purpose of it? Well, the purpose of it was to do away with his whole life's work. They wanted to get rid of him. They wanted to just simply blot his name out forever. Everything he stood for, everything his life work, they wanted to blot out. And so Jeremiah asked for God's judgment because Jeremiah, you know, he knows the law, and he says that only God can judge righteously. So he presented his cause to God as if in a trial situation. And, you know, God says, you know, the reason that they stored his life is because they wanted him to stop prophesying. And it was an attempt to silence the word of God from being spoken. So it was an affront against God himself because, you know, Jeremiah was God's mouthpiece. And so if they want to kill Jeremiah, they're actually saying, we don't want to hear the word of God anymore either. So the judgment upon the conspirators here is that they're going to die by sword and famine. And this will continue on till no remnant remains of the families of the conspirators, not the entire city of Anathoth, but just the families of the conspirators. And so now we come into chapter 12, and we see Jeremiah's complaint in verses 1 to 4 of chapter 12. So we're in this section still, which is the resulting judgment, which goes right down until chapter 12, verse 17. So the conspiracy against his life shook Jeremiah to the core. And we see in chapter 12, verse 1, Jeremiah contends with God. Righteous art thou, O Jehovah, when I contend with thee. Yet would I reason the cause with thee? Wherefore doth the way of the wicked prosper? Wherefore are all they at ease that deal very treacherously? Again, we see him using the term contend here, which is that Hebrew word riv. This is the same legal brief that he earlier issued against the conspirators back in chapter 11, verse 20. And he now issues it against God. And so Jeremiah, in his depressed state, in his depression, desires to take God to court. Now, Jeremiah, he does recognize and he does confess that God is righteous. And so there's no doubt in Jeremiah that God is righteous. And so he felt that he could contend with God because he's righteous. However, there seem to be certain inconsistencies in the land in light of God's righteousness. And so Jeremiah still has this one issue that he needs to diffuse. He recognizes God's righteousness, and yet he is going to reason with him. He reasons with God. And the issue that he's dealing with is found in the second part of verse 1 and into verse 2. And there are two issues involved. First of all, wherefore doth the way of the wicked prosper? Wherefore are all they at ease that deal treacherously? So what he's asking, you know, God, he says, why do the wicked prosper? The wicked deal very treacherously. And the Hebrew wording is a little bit stronger. It literally says like that these people are treacherous of treachery, treacherous in their treachery. They were treacherous and they were happy about it. And so Jeremiah is wrestling with the question why these wicked ones seem to prosper. Now, it's not just a Jeremiah problem. It's a problem every day, even to us today. And this was a common problem with the saints of the Old Testament because they often struggled. We find Job, for instance, struggling with this problem. David in Psalm 37, same issue. Asaph, he also struggled with this in Psalm 73. Why do the wicked prosper? And we ask the same question today. Why do they prosper? So that's his first problem. The second problem is even worse, because we find that God seems to be the one who is prospering them. After all, God, he's sovereign. As we prayed before, he's sovereign. He's made everything. He's in charge. And he seems to be responsible for their prosperity. Because Jeremiah says in verse 2, you have planted them. Yes, they have taken root. They grow. Yes, they bring forth fruit. And their fruit, which we see here, is treachery by which they grow and prosper. Jeremiah goes on to say, he says, you are near in their mouth and far from their heart. So what he's saying is that while these treacherous workers, while they come near to God with their mouth, externally, their heart is far from God internally. So the conspiracy at the end of chapter 11 has placed Jeremiah in this accusatory frame of mind. The guy is pretty shaken up by what's going on, by this attempt in his life. In verse 3, but thou, O Jehovah, knowest me. Thou seest me, and thou triest my heart toward thee. So what he's saying is, he says, God, you know me. You see me, you try my heart. And Jeremiah used the Hebrew term yada, Y-I-D-A, for know. And what he's doing here, he's indicating that God knew him on a very deep level after having tested his heart in regard to himself. And have a look back in chapter 6, verse 27, and on from there, you'll see that. So what he's saying here is that in contrast to the wicked ones, the prophet was able to stand before God on a righteous basis. And then in the second part of verse 3, Jeremiah says, pull them out like sheep for the slaughter. Prepare them for the day of slaughter. So he's actually praying for the destruction of the wicked ones. And the implication of his prayer here is that God should destroy the wicked. The wicked should be suffering, is what he's saying. And so he hoped that God would drag him off like sheep to be slaughtered. Now remember, previously, back in chapter 11, verse 19, the wicked treated him like a gentle lamb led to the slaughter. But that's not Jeremiah's take on them. Jeremiah, the righteous, he's righteous compared to them. He is the one who is suffering and is in danger of being murdered. So he prayed that God would set apart the wicked for their day of slaughter. Deliver me, he's saying, by their death. And we see in verse 4, it says, how long shall the land mourn and the herbs of the whole country wither? For the wickedness of them that dwell therein, the beasts are consumed and the birds, because they said, he shall not see our latter end. So, because God has permitted these wicked ones to remain, the result of their wickedness we find in verse 4 is that the land will suffer judgment. Why is God bringing judgment upon their nation? Jeremiah was well aware of the fact that God set up leaders and took them down. It is he who raises up presidents, kings, prime ministers. And so from Jeremiah's perspective, it was almost as if God had deliberately put Judah's wicked leaders into their respective positions so that he would have an excuse to destroy the land. That's from his perspective. Now, these wicked are bringing judgment upon the entire country. The wicked ones say that he'll not see our final end. So Jeremiah here is quoting the treacherous ones as saying this. So their response to his prophecies is that even if his prophecies do come true, they will not come true in their own lifetime. So what they're saying is, listen, we're going to die before the prophecy of Jeremiah come to pass. So we've got nothing to worry about. That was their attitude. So this is Jeremiah's complaint against God. He now receives God's answer in verses 5 to 6. Using two figures of speech in verse 5, he told Jeremiah that the worst was yet to come. He says, if you've run with the footmen and they have wearied you, then how can you contend with horses? And though in a land of peace you're secure, how will you do in the pride of the Jordan? So the first figure of speech here in running with footmen is about physical prowess. If running a foot race had exhausted the prophet, how could he compete against horses? That's the first figure. The second figure is concerned with local opposition. If Jeremiah did not feel secure in his own land during the days of peace, how is he going to fare in the pride of the Jordan? Now, the pride of the Jordan refers to the swelling of the Jordan River. It refers to the narrow strip of land on either side of the river, which was heavy with foliage and vegetation. It was also filled with wild animals, and they included lions who lived there. So the pride of the Jordan is mentioned in three other places in Scripture. We find it in Jeremiah 49, verse 19. So that's Jeremiah 49, 19, Jeremiah 50, verse 44, and Zechariah 11, verse 3. So God told Jeremiah through these two figures of speech here that he is much too impatient. Jeremiah will suffer many more conspiracies in his life. And the conspiracy of Anathoth is just the beginning. It's just a starting point. And the plot of Anathoth will be insignificant compared to what he'll suffer in the future. So Jeremiah has a lot to look forward to. For even thy, verse 6 says, for even thy brethren in the house of your father, even they have dealt treacherously with you. Even they have cried aloud after you. Believe them not, though they speak their fair words unto you. So Jeremiah's obligation in verse 6 is not to question God with how he deals with his universe. Jeremiah's responsibility, just like our responsibility, is to keep the faith. If he truly recognizes, as he did in verse 1, that Jehovah is righteous, which means that he will do everything correctly, everything right, then he will know that God's righteousness will work its way out. But God's righteousness is going to be worked out in God's timetable and not in man's, not in Jeremiah's timetable. So Jeremiah's responsibility is to keep the faith and let God handle the rest. God also tells him in verse 6 that even his own family has been part of the conspiracy. His brothers, his physical brothers, were part of the conspiracy to kill him. So even though his family may speak favorably to him, Jeremiah is not to be deceived by it. God says to him, do not believe them, even though they speak smooth words to you. They're plotting against you. And in verses 7 to 13, we have the judgment of Judah and we have Jehovah's lament. Verse 7, we'll read these 7 to 13. I have forsaken my house. I have cast off my heritage. I have given the dearly beloved of my soul into the hand of her enemies. My heritage is become unto me as a lion in the forest. She hath uttered her voice against me. Therefore I have hated her. Is my heritage unto me as a speckled bird of prey? Are the birds of prey against her round about? Go ye, assemble all the beasts of the field, bring them to devour. Many shepherds have destroyed my vineyard. They have trodden my portion on the foot. They have made my pleasant portion a desolate wilderness. Verse 11. They have made it a desolation. It mourneth unto me, being desolate. The whole land is made desolate, because no man layeth it to heart. Destroyers will come upon all the bare heights in the wilderness. For the sword of Jehovah devoureth from the one end of the land, even to the other end of the land. No flesh hath peace. They have sown wheat and have reaped thorns. They have put themselves to pain and profit nothing, and ye shall be ashamed of your fruits because of the fierce anger of Jehovah. So here we have the judgment of Judah spelled out in these verses 7 to 13. This is also a picture of Jehovah lamenting his judgment. Now, the possible historical background to these words can be found in 2 Kings 24, verses 1 to 2. Now, in those verses, Nebuchadnezzar was not quite ready to move his whole force against the people. Therefore, what he did was he hired some of the smaller kingdoms under him to send bands and guerrilla attacks against Judah. And little by little, more and more of the land was being devastated on all sides. So this covers the period of round about 602 to 598 BC. As God expresses his own lamentation on the judgment that he must send upon Judah, he uses the word my house, my heritage, my beloved. He uses the word my a number of times, and each time he uses it to describe some figure in which he relates Israel to himself. Altogether, we're going to see seven my things are being used in these verses. The first one in verse 7, it is the heritage that is forsaken. The first figure is my house. Israel is the house of God according to Exodus 29, verses 45 to 46, and Numbers 35, verse 34. So Israel as a nation was the place of God's dwelling, but now this house is going to be torn down. The second we have is, I have cast off my heritage. The term my heritage, well, this is used 3 different times in this segment. The emphasis is that Israel is also God's inheritance. And this is based upon 2 passages in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 20, and Deuteronomy 9, verse 26. Thirdly, I have given my dearly beloved of my soul into the hands of her enemies. This is the figure, my dearly beloved. Now, this was referred earlier in Jeremiah chapter 11, verse 15. And this emphasizes the relationship of Israel as the wife of Jehovah. Fourthly, in verse 8, he gives a reason for the coming judgment for which he now laments. My heritage, meaning Israel, has become unto me as a lion in the forest. So this is the fourth figure. We have Israel is a lion who has roared in defiance against God. And in verse 9, the heritage has also become a speckled bird of prey. Now, where we see in verse 8, God's heritage became a roaring lion against him. Here in verse 9, Israel became a speckled bird of prey. Now, this is the fifth figure. It's a speckled bird of prey. The speckled bird of prey was a strange-looking bird that was recognized for strangeness by the other birds of prey, and it was attacked by the rest of the flock. So while Israel herself is a bird of prey, other birds of prey will now attack upon her. And part of the judgment is that the Gentile nations, among whom the Jews will be dispersed, will recognize that the Jews are somewhat different. They're different to the others. And because the Jews are somewhat different, they will be attacked. So while the birds of prey or vultures possibly are attacking the speckled bird of prey, all the wild animals also will help devour the body that remains. All the beasts of the field will do the same. In verses 10 to 11, Israel is now the vineyard of God. And this is the sixth figure, my vineyard. Now, many shepherds have destroyed my vineyard. They have trodden my portion underfoot. So this builds upon what the prophet Isaiah had said previously in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 1, that they have trodden my portion underfoot. Isaiah chapter 5, verse 1 says this: "Let me sing for my well-beloved a song of my beloved touching his vineyard. My well-beloved had a vineyard in a very fruitful hill." So here we have Isaiah speaking about his vineyard, my vineyard. The seventh figure is my portion. They have made the pleasant portion a desert wilderness. In verses 10 to 11, and especially in verse 10, the emphasis is upon the guilt of the leaders for destroying the vineyard of God. And this is a very common motif throughout the Old Testament. Israel is the vineyard of God, and the leaders have destroyed her. Now, this is picked up in the New Testament and applied by Jesus to the relationship of the Pharisees to Israel, because he accused the Pharisees of being responsible for spoiling the vineyard. And you can have a look at that in Mark chapter 12, verses 1 to 12. Mark 12, verses 1 to 12. In verse 11, we have the devastation of the vineyard, or God's portion is further explained here. "They have made it a desolation. It mourns unto me, being desolate. The whole land is made desolate, because no man lays it to heart." So because of the guilt of Israel's leaders, God's portion has now been turned into desolation. Now, verses 7 to 11 provide the background to the judgment of verse 12. "Destroyers are come upon all the bare heights in the wilderness. For the sword of Jehovah devours from the one end of the land, even to the other end of the land. No flesh has peace." So God's judgment is going to be meted out by destroyers. That is, destroyers here are the Gentile nations. Yet it would be Jehovah's sword that would actually devour the people of Judah, with the result that there would be no peace anywhere in Judah. Notice the verse mentions the bare heights. Well, Jeremiah pointed out back in chapter 3, verse 2, that these were the centers of Jewish idolatry. It's also in Jeremiah 7, verse 29 as well. Verse 13 summarizes the reason for the judgment. "They have sown wheat and have reaped thorns. They have put themselves to pain and profit nothing. And you shall be ashamed of your fruits because of the fierce anger of Jehovah." The picture here is of Judah having sown wheat and reaping thorns. It shows here that the people were suffering from a self-inflicted wound. The self-inflicted wound was by means of the worship of idols, and their guilt brought the pain. It did not profit them one iota. They wasted their energy and they had nothing to show for it. They shall be ashamed of their fruit because of the fierce anger of Jehovah. Now, earlier on, these words were used in connection with the worship of idols. So what it virtually is saying here is that they would be ashamed of their fruits, their idolatry. These idols are going to prove to be of no help to them when the judgment strikes. Remember, these were items of wood and stone made by their own hands. Now, having said these words to the Jews in verses 14 to 17, he's going to give the message to the Gentiles. They're not going to miss out. Now, verses 14 to 17 follow the principle of the Abrahamic covenant, that while God will use Gentiles to punish the Jewish people, eventually he will then punish those Gentiles as well. In verse 14, "Thus says Jehovah against all mine evil neighbors." So the neighbors of Israel, the Gentile nations, and the word of God now comes to these Gentile nations. "Their sin is that they touch the inheritance which I have caused my people Israel to inherit." They touched the land of Israel, which God had caused his people to inherit. Now, when the Jews were taken into the Babylonian captivity, the surrounding nations settled upon Jewish land. They thought, whoa, they've taken away, we'll just move in. So these evil neighbors, they settled upon the land which the Jews vacated. And these included the Samaritans, the Nabateans, Edomites, Moabites, Philistines, and other smaller tribes. And the result of this invasion, I will pluck them up from off their land. So God would uproot these Gentiles from their own land. Now, while enjoyment of for Israel, while enjoyment of the land is conditioned upon obedience, ownership of the land of Israel is not conditioned by obedience. Through the Abrahamic covenant, God gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people unconditionally. It belongs to them whether they were in obedience or not. The enjoyment of this land is based upon the condition of obedience to the Mosaic covenant. And this principle is brought out by the land covenant, which is another covenant God made with them, and the land covenant, which you can find in Deuteronomy 29 to Deuteronomy 30, verse 20. So it's Deuteronomy 29 to Deuteronomy 30, verse 20. Now, this land covenant is still in force today. The special importance of the land covenant is that it reaffirms the title deed to the land of Israel as belonging to the Jewish people. Although they would prove unfaithful and disobedient, the right to the land would never, ever be taken from them. It also shows that the conditional Mosaic covenant did not set aside the unconditional Abrahamic covenant. The ownership of the land is always in the hands of the Jews by divine grant. God granted this land to them, and it is an unconditional covenant. Now, these Gentile nations all began moving into the vacated Jewish territory, but now God says that he would eventually pluck these foreigners out of their own land. So they're going to be forced out of their land. That is one side of the coin. They're going to be forced out of their own land. The other side of the coin is that God will pluck up the house of Judah from among them, which means that he's going to pull the Jews out of the other countries, the other Gentile countries from which the Jews had been scattered, and he's going to bring them back into the Jewish land. Now, the principle here still holds. When the Jews were forced to vacate the land in AD 70, the land was principally settled by Arabs. Nevertheless, because the promise still holds true and the land is Jewish, God will remove the Arabs from Jewish territory. And on the one hand, there is a promise of restoration for Israel. On the other hand, there's a promise of judgment for those non-Jews who have moved into Jewish territory. Now, in summary of verse 14, what we see is that there's a promise of blessing for Israel and a promise of punishment for those who have taken over Jewish land. In verse 15, God will have compassion upon Israel after their restoration. And it shall come to pass, after that I have plucked them up, I will return and have compassion on them, and I will bring them again, every man to his heritage and every man to his land. So twice in this verse, Jeremiah uses his favorite word, shuv. Remember back in the introduction, S-H-U-V, shuv. Once when Jehovah said that he would return, or shuv means to return, and the second time when he said that he would bring them again. So Jehovah promised that one day he would have compassion on his people once again, and he'd bring them back to their land. Now, it shall come to pass. This may indicate that this verse does not only refer to Israel's return from Babylon, but also to the final return of the Jewish people at the end of the tribulation. One passage here that deals with this final return is Deuteronomy 29, verses 1 to Deuteronomy 30, verse 20, same as the land covenant. So after a long period of persecution described in chapter 29 of Deuteronomy, there's going to be a regeneration of Israel as she returns to the Lord. Verses 16 to 17 deal with the Gentile nations in this future kingdom. According to verse 16, these nations will receive blessings for obedience. And it shall come to pass, if they will diligently learn the ways of my people, to swear by my name, as Jehovah lives, even as they taught my people to swear by Baal, then shall they be built up in the midst of my people. So again, what we see here is that the verse starts with, it shall come to pass, putting the message into the prophetic future. So Gentile nations would eventually have the opportunity to learn the ways of the Jewish people. And part of these ways is to swear by God's name. To swear by God's name means to be in submission to him. And the verse makes another important point here. It begins with a strong conditional clause. If they will diligently learn, he's speaking of the Gentiles here. This condition is followed by the consequence. If the Gentile neighbors of Israel were to turn to Jehovah, then they would grow and develop in the midst of God's people. Now, in the past, the Jewish people learned the wicked ways of the Gentiles. However, there's going to come a time when the Gentiles have the opportunity to learn the righteous ways of the Jews. And if they obey and learn from the Jews, then they'll be built up and thrive in the midst of Jehovah's people. Now, the one who develops this theme a bit further is more than Jeremiah, that is Zechariah. Now, in Zechariah chapter 8, verse 29, Zechariah pictured the future kingdom in the following way. Thus says Jehovah of hosts, in those days it shall come to pass that 10 men shall take hold out of all the languages of the nations, they shall take hold of the skirt of him that is a Jew, saying, we will go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. So in the past, and even today, when 10 Gentiles grabbed the clothes of a Jew, it was for other reasons than to say, let us go with you because we have heard that God is with you. So that this will be in the future. At the time of the final restoration, the Jews will no longer be reproached. Instead, they'll be treated with reverent respect. Why? Because they'll be known as the ministers of Jehovah. In Zechariah 14, during the kingdom, the Gentiles will be obligated to observe the Feast of Tabernacles. And if they obey, they'll receive a blessing. Disobey, they'll receive a curse, and that curse will be a drought. So as the Gentiles begin to learn the righteous ways of the Jews in contrast to the past when the Jews learned the unrighteous way of the Gentiles, then they're going to be built up in the midst of God's people. And these Gentile nations will be able to populate the Gentile nations in the kingdom. Verse 17, but if they will not hear, then will I pluck up that nation, plucking up and destroying it, says Jehovah. So if the Gentiles do not learn the ways of the Jews in their righteousness, then God will pluck up that nation. And one of the reasons why the Messiah must rule the nations with a rod of iron is because there'll still be that tendency to be disobedient. And this iron-handed rule is rooted in Psalm chapter 2, verse 9. You shall break them with a rod of iron, you shall dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Remember, the people populating the nations will still have their sin nature. The first generation of those living in the Messianic kingdom will all be believers, but they're going to procreate, they're going to have children. And there'll be unbelievers present in the second generation. And the natural outworking of that sin nature will have to be restrained. The kingdom is not going to be a democracy, it's going to be an absolute monarchy. And the reign of the Messianic king will be a very strict one. The righteous and just laws emanating from Jerusalem will have to be obeyed. Now we're into the symbolic action in chapter 13, verses 1 to 27. So we've done now with the broken covenant and the judgment. Jeremiah's third message ends in chapter 13 here he's going to talk about a symbolic action. And the purpose of this action is to demonstrate Judah's corruption in verses 1 to 11. Then he's going to give a parable how Jehovah will destroy Judah's arrogance in verses 12 to 14, followed by a warning against pride in 15 to 17, a lament over the royal family in 18 to 19, and then closes off verses 20 to 27 with the judgments on Jerusalem. First up, we have a linen girdle. And this is the first 11 verses. Thus says Jehovah unto me, go and buy you a linen girdle and put it upon your loins, and put it not in water. So I bought a girdle according to the word of Jehovah, and put it upon my loins. The word of Jehovah came unto me the second time, saying, take the girdle that you have bought, which is upon your loins, and arise, go to the Euphrates, and hide it there in a cleft of the rock. So I went and hid it by the Euphrates, as Jehovah commanded me. And it came to pass after many days that Jehovah said unto me, arise, go to the Euphrates, take the girdle from thence, which I commanded you to hide there. Then I went to the Euphrates and dug and took the girdle from the place where I had hid it. And behold, the girdle was marred. It was profitable for nothing. So in these 7 verses, Jeremiah received 3 commands to do some pretty strange things. First command was to go and buy a linen girdle. Now this was the common undergarment. It was like a short skirt that men wore, and it went around their hips and reached midway down the thighs. Now the word he uses for girdle is a word used only 6 other times in Scripture, and Jeremiah uses it in his book a total of 8 times. The girdle was important because it was part of the attire of a priest. And we find this in Leviticus chapter 16, verse 4. He shall put on the holy linen coat. He shall have the linen breeches upon his flesh, and shall be girded with linen girdle. And goes on. So, and they are the holy garments. So the girdle was a holy garment. The Hebrew word here is not exactly the same, but it symbolizes the priestly calling of Israel to be a nation of priests, according to Exodus chapter 19, verse 6. Exodus 19:6, Israel, a nation of priests. So he's bought the girdle. Jeremiah was to put it upon his loins, wrap it around his waist. Now, this act symbolizes Israel's closeness to God. Finally, Jeremiah was instructed not to put the girdle in the water. So by not washing the girdle, it means that it would have turned filthy and would have remained that way on the road to the Euphrates, where Jeremiah was then supposed to carry the item on his body. So as a filthy girdle, it is denoting the people of Israel. And verse 2 says, so I bought the girdle according to the word, put it on my loins. Second commandment to Jeremiah comes in verses 3 to 4. The second time word comes to him, take the girdle you've bought upon your loins, arise, go to Euphrates, hide it there in the cleft of the rock. So Jeremiah was to walk to the Euphrates River and bury the girdle that he had carried wrapped around his waist. Now, the Euphrates, it originates in Turkey and it flows through Syria and Iraq before joining the Tigris River in a place called Shatt al-Arab, and it then empties into the Persian Gulf. In Jeremiah's day, the primary country that was located in that area of Mesopotamia along the Euphrates was Babylon. So this 700-mile round trip from Jerusalem to the Euphrates and back would have put Jeremiah in contact with Babylon for the first time. You know, very little of Jeremiah's prophecies are recorded in the last days of Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim, and that's the king. That allowed for plenty of time for such a trip. In fact, it allows for 2 such trips which he must make. He must walk 350 miles and then hide it in the cleft of the rock. And in verse 5, he obeyed, went and hid it by the Euphrates as commanded by Jehovah. Then he went back to Judah. And shortly after, in verse 6, came the 3rd command. After many days, he was given another command, arise, go to the Euphrates and take the girdle from thence. Well, obviously, he probably needed to rest for a little while before. So it says after many days, he probably needed to rest for a while. So he's told to make the trip once again, 350 miles back to the Euphrates. And he's to go to the place where he'd hidden the linen girdle, and he's to dig it out. Then I went to the Euphrates and digged and took the girdle from the place where I had hid it. And behold, the girdle was marred. It was profitable for nothing. So when Jeremiah reached the Euphrates a second time, he was able to observe something that could be described as the outworking of the law of entropy. entropy, entropy. What does that mean? Well, it means that this law states that if something is left to itself, any isolated system will degenerate from greater order to lesser order. And this is exactly what happened to the girdle. The girdle was now marred and was good for nothing. We have the interpretation of this in verses 8 to 11. Verse 8 introduces the section. Then the word of Jehovah came unto me, saying. So having obeyed all these three commands, now God interprets that which Jeremiah had to literally perform. Would have been a very fit man. He's walked 1,400 miles. Wow. The linen girdle represented Judah. Thus says Jehovah, verse 9. Thus says Jehovah, after this manner will I mar the pride of Judah and the great pride of Jerusalem. So what we see here is that the linen girdle now represented Judah. And just as this girdle was ruined by the waters of Babylon, so God would destroy the pride of Judah by means of that empire. And this point was made earlier without mentioning Babylon back in chapter 2, verse 18. And now what have you to do in the way to Egypt and to drink the waters of the Shihor? Or what have you to do in the way of Assyria to drink the waters of the river? So Assyria no longer existed as a kingdom or an empire in Jeremiah's day. So to go into Assyria meant you were entering into Babylon. That's Jeremiah 2, verse 18. Verse 10 provides interpretation of the girdle's marring. This evil people that refuse to hear my words, that walk in the stubbornness of their heart, and are gone after other gods to serve them and to worship them, shall be as this girdle, which is profitable for nothing. So the people of Judah would be corrupted by their contact with Babylon, just as a girdle was destroyed by the Euphrates River. The girdle became worthless, and so would the people become profitable for nothing. And the reasons of the marring are three. First of all, the rejection of the word of God as seen by their disobedience. Second, they walked according to their own stubborn hearts. And third, they have gone after other gods, both to serve and worship them. In verse 11 is the interpretation of the cleaving aspects. For as the girdle cleaves to the loins of a man, so have I caused to cleave unto me the whole house of Israel and the whole house of Judah, says Jehovah, that they may be unto me for a people and for a name and for a praise and for a glory, but they would not hear. So as the girdle cleaved to the loins of Jeremiah, so God has caused both houses of Israel and Judah to cleave to himself. And the purpose of the cleaving was that Israel could be God's people. Israel was to be a name, a praise, and a glory. Now, according to Jeremiah 26, verse 19, this had always been their calling. However, Israel refused to be all those things before God, because in verse 11, the second part we see, but they would not hear. Now we have the parable of the wine jars in verses 12 to 14 of chapter 13. In verse 12 is the story of the proverb. Jeremiah is to go before the people and recite a very well-known proverb. The proverb said, every bottle shall be filled with wine. And the word for bottle here refers to a very large earthen vessel, which they've found many of them through archaeology. Now, they can hold up to 10 gallons of wine each. Isaiah 30, verse 14 also mentioned these. Isaiah 30, verse 14. So this common proverb that every one of these would be filled with wine, Jeremiah was to go before the people and repeat it. And the people would respond with, do we not certainly know that every bottle will be filled with wine? So the people's attitude will be, are you teaching us things that we already know? Are you trying to teach us very simple, well-known things? That's exactly what he's trying to do. Then shall you say to them, verse 13, thus says Jehovah, behold, I will fill all the inhabitants of this land, even the kings that sit upon David's throne, and the priests, and the prophets, and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem with drunkenness. So, having gotten the point across in verse 13, he states what the wine represents. The wine did not represent actual wine, but it represents the wrath of God. All the inhabitants of the land will be drunk with God's wrath. There will be no exclusions. It will include the kings from David's throne, the priests, the prophets, and all the people. The result in verse 14, and I will dash them one against another, even the fathers and the sons together, says Jehovah. I will not pity nor spare, nor have compassion, that I should not destroy them. So when they're drunk with the wrath of God, they'll dash themselves to pieces. Father and son will run into each other. As the destruction grows in severity, God's response will include neither pity nor compassion, but only destruction. And in verse 15 to 17, we have the warning against pride. Hear ye and give ear, be not proud, for Jehovah has spoken. Give glory to Jehovah your God before he causes darkness, before your feet stumble upon the dark mountains. And while you look for light, he turn it into the shadow of death and make it gross darkness. But if you will not hear it, my soul shall weep in secret for your pride, and mine eyes shall weep sore and run down with tears, because Jehovah's flock is taken captive. Now, the admonition is, don't be proud. The one to glorify, the one to be proud in is Jehovah, the God of power, which we see in verse 16. He's the one who's able to cause darkness. So as a person looks for light to keep himself from stumbling, he turns it into the shadow of death. He causes gross darkness to come upon them. And in verse 17, if you don't heed the warning, if they fail in this area, then Jeremiah's own soul will weep in secret over Israel's pride. Jeremiah will weep because he knows that the pride of Israel is going to lead to her ultimate judgment, which is captivity. In verse 18 to 19, we have the lament for the royal family. Say you unto the king and to the queen mother, humble yourselves, sit down, for your head tires are come down, even the crown of your glory. Now in verses 18 to 19, we have the weeping for the royal family. The king and queen mother he's referring to, according to 2 Kings 24, verse 8, were King Jehoiakim and the queen mother Nehushta. He pronounces the demise of the royal family when they'll be dethroned. And the fulfillment of verse 18 is given 4 times in scripture. We have it in 2 Kings 24, 9 to 15, 2 Kings 24, 9 to 15, Jeremiah 22, verse 24 to 30, 22, 24 to 30, Jeremiah 29, verse 2, 29, 2, and Jeremiah 52, 31 to 34. So we're going to see them a bit later on. Now, not only will the royal family go into captivity and be dethroned, but in verse 19, the cities of the south are shut up, and there is none to open them. Judah is carried away captive, all of it. It is wholly carried away captive. Other parts of the country will also be captured and carried into captivity. In particular, the cities of the south or the Negev are mentioned. Judah will be carried away captive. So all of Judah being carried away. No mention is made of who will be carrying them away. But later on, later chapters of Jeremiah clearly state that it was Babylon. Assyria had not been able to exile all of the people, but Babylon would not fail. So the third message and the chapter end with the judgments of Jerusalem. In verses 20 to 21, the captivity is now mentioned. Lift up your eyes and behold them that come from the north. Where is the flock that was given you, your beautiful flock? Coming from the north, again, the references to Babylon here. The invasion is from the north and will take the flock of God into captivity. The term flock refers to the cities of Judah. The picture is this. Jerusalem, the capital city, was the shepherd, while Judah's cities were the flock. And so Jerusalem, as a shepherd, has left her flock to be destroyed. Jerusalem proved to be a bad shepherd who allowed others to destroy the flock. She's now being called into into account for failing to be a true shepherd. Therefore, Jerusalem, the ruler, is now to be ruled over in verse 21. What will you say when he shall set over you as head those whom you have yourself taught to be friends to you? And shall not sorrows take hold of you as of a woman in travail? So Jerusalem will be ruled over by the very ones she thought were her friends. The very ones that Jerusalem counted on for friendship will prove to be her tyrants. She'll then have the sorrow of a woman in travail. There are two reasons for the judgment of Jerusalem. First, the spiritual adultery of Jerusalem in verse 22. Verse 22 describes the city's response to this tragedy. And if you say in your heart, wherefore are these things come upon me? For the greatness of your iniquity are your skirts uncovered, and your heels suffer violence. Now, the magnitude of Jerusalem's sins necessitated the judgment. And this judgment here is likened to the exposure of a naked body. Jerusalem would be greatly dishonored because her skirts would be removed and her heels exposed. Now, especially the uncovering of the skirts bit, this refers to the commandments of the Mosaic law that regard sexual offenses, and we find them in Leviticus 18, 6-19, Leviticus 20, verse 17, and Deuteronomy 22, verse 30, and Deuteronomy 27, verse 20. They're there on your screen. Now, Jerusalem was guilty of sexual offenses because she had committed spiritual adultery in the worship of idols. Now, therefore, what we see because of that is her secret parts would then be uncovered, just as one shamefully treats a prostitute. And the parallel to this is Hosea chapter 2, verse 10. Hosea chapter 2, verse 10 is a parallel to this. Also, Nahum 3, verse 5 as well. Nahum 3, verse 5. Now, verse 23 lists another reason for the coming judgment. Can the Ethiopian change his skin, or the leopard his spots? Then may you also do good that are accustomed to do evil. So, virtually, can a black man become white? No. Can a leopard change his spots? No. The reason for the judgment is that Jerusalem was beyond change. Neither people nor animals can have control over their physical appearance. So the answer to these questions is negative. The point is that if these things were possible, if a leopard can change his spots, if that was at all possible, then Judah, which had become accustomed to doing evil, would then be able to do good. But Judah has come so far that they can no longer do any good whatsoever. And the force of habit causes her to become a greater sin still. After centuries of apostasy and spiritual adultery, Jerusalem had become incapable of changing her ways. And verse 24 shows the result. Therefore will I scatter them as the stubble that passes away by the wind of the wilderness. So Jehovah would scatter Judah like chaff from a threshing floor that is carried away by the wind of the desert. Again, in verse 25, this is thy lot, the portion measured unto you from me, says Jehovah, because you have forgotten me and trusted in falsehood. Jerusalem had forgotten God and trusted in falsehood. What falsehood? Well, she trusted the falsehood of idolatry. She thought those things that she'd made with her hands could save her. Verse 26 says, therefore will I also uncover your skirts upon your face, and your shame shall appear. So as a prostitute is shamed, so Jerusalem will be shamed. And because of the sin of verse 25, she'll be treated like a shameful prostitute. She is to be treated that way because of Jerusalem's adultery in verse 27. I have seen your abominations, even your adulteries, and your neighings, the lewdness of your whoredom on the hills and the field. Woe unto you, O Jerusalem! You will not be made clean. How long shall it yet be? The word abomination means idols and idolatry. She has committed spiritual adultery by means of idolatry. However, This spiritual adultery also led to physical adultery, because the next word is neighing, like a horse, like a stallion neighs. Earlier on in Jeremiah 5, verse 8, we noted that he pictured the inhabitants of Jerusalem as stallions neighing after their neighbors' wives. So both types of adultery are pictured here. It began with spiritual adultery and it led to physical adultery. And the result is, woe unto you, O Jerusalem, you will not be made clean. How long should it yet be? So while Jeremiah did not know the answer to the question of how long it was going to be, history has shown that the judgment struck in 586 BC when Babylon destroyed the city. And with this woe, Jeremiah's third message now ends. And that's where we also end. Thank you for coming along. Study hard, grow strong.